So hello and welcome back, and this is going to be more bonus video and less history video because I'm talking about something that's more of a current event rather than something that's more historical in nature. So yes, this is going to be talking about Amtrak's 2035 map, which I find incredibly lackluster, and it's an $80 billion funding ask, of which about $55 billion of it is just going to the Northeast Corridor. So it's just there to clear the backlog on maintenance, so it's not so great for the rest of the country. I mean, yeah, we get 25 billion and that's like a huge amount of money, but it's like in the grand scheme of the federal government, 25 billion over 15 years is basically nothing. For the 55 billion that the Northeast Corridor is getting, if America outside of the Northeast Corridor's like census areas got the same amount of funding per capita, they would be asking for an additional $469 billion for the rest of us, but yeah, we get 25. And that's like what, less than a 16th of that funding is going to the rest of us on a population basis, which I mean would basically give Amtrak a interstate highway project level of funding, which I think is necessary, but is also at the same time very much not going to happen, at least anytime soon. So this plan is, frankly, it's pretty minimal even by Amtrak standards. And it kind of, to me at least, brings up that 2009 meme of President Obama saying shovel-ready jobs. And from what I've gathered with these routes, that they're at least either in the ready-to-go stage or pretty close to ready to go, and that they're projects that most of the states have been planning for several years, and or they could be prodded into running. And other than that, and hopefully the next I'll pull up the map that I added to on here, is that these are routes that I frankly think should be added to the list as well, along with the ones Amtrak added. Just quick thing, orange is I think the ones that could get done by 2035. The purple ones are ones that probably should and could if there was enough funding allocated to this, and we'll get to that in a minute. So the main one, since I live in California, is I know that Nevada's DOT has finally, on their updated rail plan, actually said that they do want to extend the Capital Corridor east of Sacramento to Reno, which is just not even on the Amtrak map because they just don't even care. I remember replacing the buses up to Reading with trains, which they frankly should be, because even after the '08 recession, from what I understand, those buses were fairly full and fairly popular, so replacing them with equivalent scheduled train service would just be kind of a no-brainer, as well as connecting like San Jose up through the Central Valley into Sacramento to connect Stockton and San Jose and all those towns up. I know ACE runs there, but we're talking intercity length, so it should be an intercity service with, Amtrak level amenities and frankly more than just peak hour service. And then, routes like here in like Washington, like I remember here reading about WashDOT, they're actually studying extending a train from Seattle down to Pasco again. Montana, they've been studying whether or not they want service on their southern tier for a while, which may or may not become the North Coast Limited, or North Coast Hiawatha again. Like that may become, and that'll also be on the next map I'll show. Also, just extending service from Iowa City to Des Moines, like that's also a no-brainer. Kansas City to Des Moines, Kansas City, Omaha, also fairly no-brainer. And then getting down into like towards like the southern Midwest and into the South, like Oklahoma City to Tulsa, also kind of a no-duh. Dallas Fort Worth to like Shreveport, same thing with like Baton Rouge up to Shreveport, and even a cross Mississippi service from like Meridian to Meridian, Jackson, Vicksburg, and on into Shreveport as well. And through the south, like Mobile, like having quarter service up through Alabama, like Mobile to Montgomery, Birmingham, and a connection eventually to Nashville, across Tennessee, having like Knoxville through to Little Rock. Not saying all these would be like the same branded route or have like the same level of service end to end, but that these stretches should also merit some level of service, as well as just linking Nashville to Louisville and Cincinnati. Like that's also should be a connection. I mean, they want to extend service to Cincinnati and Louisville, like just connecting those two with how close they are would just make sense. Just like Indiana to St. Louis and St. Louis to Carbondale and eventually on to Memphis. That's a route that I think was cut in the 90s and it was just a through car service, but again, should be thought of. Like connecting Rockford to Madison. I think That was the Lake Countries Limited. Was their plan was eventually to do that? Was Rockford up into Janesville and up into Madison, and then just extensions in Michigan as well, like Bay City, Saginaw. That's never on any of their plans, and I don't really understand why. Fully connecting Detroit to Rapid City, the service to Traverse City and Muskogee, or Muskogee, I don't remember the name of that town. Sorry, I don't live on that side of the country. And then all these like little spurs in like Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey, like linking Scranton to Harrisburg makes sense. And although I didn't put it on this map, linking Harrisburg to Baltimore, again, a lot of routes that should be on this map that just don't make sense. And then like Charlotte to Columbia, Atlanta to Columbia, Columbia to Charleston, Jacksonville to Tallahassee, at least with eventual plans added to Pensacola, which would almost entirely close the gap of the Sunset Limited's eastern extension, except for the part between Pensacola and Mobile. And then west coast to Florida, route down to Fort Myers. Again, there's just so many routes on this that frankly should be done that aren't even on this list, which basically it just kind of confirms that this is a northeast-centric view, and we'll get into that opinion on Amtrak in a minute. And also just other routes like I would add to the list, like Portland to Baker City, possibly Portland to Coos Bay, because there is still a rail line there. Idaho Falls to Provo, which would give basically the Mormon corridor service, extending service north from Omaha to Sioux Falls. The service in Mississippi, a service from like Santa Fe, Hispaniola down to El Paso for the sake of leaking the system up, as well as Chicago, Fort Wayne service on into probably Cleveland or Columbus. I'm not really sure, along with linking Detroit to Cincinnati and not Rochester area down to Scranton to get the Poconos. Just again, it's like considering that like what Amtrak once would cost about $25 billion. It's like adding another 25 to that. Or even if Amtrak asked for like a total of like $200 billion and being like, yeah, can you stretch it over 15 years? Would get a lot of service out of this. It's not like this service is like ridiculous, like they're asking for something that's like ridiculously expensive. The ridiculous ask that they're asking for is the Northeast, not really the rest of the country, which is, I mean, I would say it's even insulting to states in the Northeast where they're not like immediately along the Northeast corridor, like service into like the Western Pennsylvania, Western and Northern New York, like. Why aren't they getting access, equivalent or proportional access to funding that the New York City gets? It's a ridiculous thing, just to me in general, someone who doesn't live in the Northeast or even on the East Coast at all. Which brings us to the fact that the long distance trains, which this proposal just doesn't even mention. So up here are the map, or that I would put into the ask as well. Because long distance trains, you do get a lot of bang for your buck on them, as far as like generating new interest and generating new service. So we'll go from like ones that I kind of think should happen and probably could more quickly than others, and to the ones that I think are more speculative even on my part. So the main one that I think could happen and probably will someday is the North Coast Limited being restored, because the states of Montana and at least its local governments are very heavily pushing for this. And sorry for the bit of a rapid fire on this. This is kind of a very touchy subject to me. If you haven't noticed the whole theme of the channel. Anyways, I think this is like the most likely one to have happen because it's like furthest along. They're already expanding the Chicago to Twin Cities portion. Montana wants extra service. Washington might add service in that area too. So it's like they basically just got to link up all this extra service through not Wyoming, North Dakota, and it'll become a reality so long as the equipment for a long-distance train becomes available. Secondarily, I do think, like, bringing back the Pioneer. Again, I know it's been studied to death, and people have been trying to get it going for decades, and it's just never gone anywhere. If there was a proper ask for funding, I do think it could happen, especially with long-distance fleet replacement and expansion, that it could happen. And basically, I would probably restore it onto its last routing, which was north from Denver to Cheyenne and then over and up into Seattle, which is basically the old Union Pacific Portland Rose, which discussed in a completely different video. And frankly, it's more of it would enable connections within the system. I personally wouldn't focus on the connections to Chicago as much as Amtrak has in the past. That's just a thing. I just don't understand why Amtrak is like, along with having a very Northeast-centric focus, has a very Chicago-centric focus versus how does this actually help where the train is running, not how does this help Chicago or how does this help the Northeast. And Amtrak really needs to get away from that very Northeast Chicago centered focus. And on top of that, restoring like the Desert Wind, but I would actually extend it up to Butte rather than having through cars with the Zephyr, because extending it to Butte would at least give eastern Idaho access to train service, which it hasn't had since Amtrak was created. And if the North Coast Limited was restored, it would provide a southern connection with it, which is, again, will just make the network overall better since there's more connections that could be made within it. I know I don't think we should be like focusing all the connections onto Chicago, but having some connections is good, but having all be in one spot. So the next service I do think are, at least the next three that I think are in the kind of same level of viable, but I don't really know if they'll ever happen, would be having Chicago, Florida service. I put two routes on here. One being the old City of Miami route. I'm not really sure as to what it was called. Running it through at least to Jacksonville. It would at least basically both of these routes exist to connect a bunch of bigger cities to Florida, because big vacation market, it would make sense for the cities to have service to Florida. Florida has a huge vacation market, not just for the Northeast, but also for the Midwest. Having two routes would mean more coverage meaning more ridership eventually meaning more ridership in general, because if you have corridor services and long distance services, they attract service or riders to each other, which is good because they feed each other. This is going to be a little bit of a rant about discussion forums with railway, or at least Amtrak. I don't really get why people have this like stupid conflict between long distance and short distance trains. They feed each other. Stop arguing over that. You can have both of them grow at the same time instead of one at the expense of the other, and that mentality is just ridiculously stupid. Anyways, that rant over. The other connection I would say being that's in the same kind of bin of it could happen would be Chicago to New York over the old Broadway Limited route through like Fort Myers and up into Cleveland, and then over the Pennsylvanians route. Again, could happen. And then the last two long distance routes on here I don't think will happen, but could and would make sense, would be restoring service basically over the old southern route from it, basically running the same as the Crescent, but at Atlanta splitting and going to Montgomery and then down to Mobile and into New Orleans. I know in the 90s, Amtrak did have a section split off from the Crescent at Birmingham and then run down to Montgomery and Mobile, but was canceled due to equipment shortages after the Viewliners were ordered because they didn't order enough. But I would say that having actual corridor service between Montgomery, Birmingham, and down eventually to Mobile would make more sense, and just have the long-distance train, run all the way through to Mobile over the more direct route, which would enable the people in the rural areas between Montgomery and Atlanta to have some level of service beyond the corridor route that Amtrak wants. And then the last one being Minneapolis to Houston, which would basically be the Twin Star Rocket. So Minneapolis to Kansas City, and then eventually down over the Santa Fe route into Houston. Again, it would provide a lot of connections, north-south connection that doesn't involve Chicago, which is probably why this will never happen on its own. And since I want to hopefully keep this video under like an hour, I'm going to talk about like the last level of service that I would want to add, which is just having more interstate routes like the Palmetto. And basically this map is going to be I'm honestly just going to do this as a rapid fire from east to west. So like Washington to Nashville, Charlotte to Tampa through Columbia, and then down the Silver route, Chicago to Memphis, Chicago Kansas City, Chicago to Omaha over the Rock Island route, and then Minneapolis to Rapid City, Omaha to Denver, Kansas City to Albuquerque over the Santa Fe Southern Transcon, Kansas City down to Fort Worth, and where else are we? Kansas City to Minneapolis, Denver to Albuquerque, Denver to Salt Lake to Oakland, and then Albuquerque to Flagstaff, along with Sacramento to Bend, Oregon, which Bend, Oregon doesn't have service, and then added service between Portland and Spokane. Again, rapid firing that. The Palmetto routes, or at least routes in that vein, which are kind of like longer distance coach trains, are also necessary because they can cover a lot of rural areas that don't really have great transit service, because Greyhound and other companies have kind of cut back a lot of their bus service. Having these train routes running more frequencies and more convenient, hopefully, daytime services wouldn't just enable Amtrak to grow. It would provide a good service to the people in this area, and which overall would make it so that Amtrak's political benefactors actually enjoy it more and are more willing to keep it funded. This Northeast corridor-centric focus is going to kill Amtrak in the long run, because if Amtrak becomes mostly a New York, Boston, Washington service, there's going to be a lot less appetite for national funding for this. And I would rather see Amtrak grow in various different product segments and service segments than it just kind of like wither and die because, God forbid they ask for anything outside the Northeast corridor more than a pittance to keep us, us peasants happy. And the last thing I am going to touch on this is that, or at least one of the last things, is that people's average longest distance trip is 300 miles. So, like, with some of these services like Nashville to, like, Washington, it doesn't really need to go all the way into New York, frankly, because people only really travel at most on average 300 miles. So it doesn't always make sense to just have everything go to, like, New York. Like, if they were to run the Palmetto more than once a day, honestly, it should probably start in Washington or Richmond and then run south instead of starting in New York. Because, frankly, if anyone wants to get north of DC on one of these other like on a hypothetical third, fourth, Palmetto run, if they want to get north of Washington, there's always going to be extra service around the transfer too. And it would make more sense to have the services be more convenient for south of DC rather than north because of how local transit tends to be, even over more medium to long distance travel. And as I said, not everything has to be centered around New York. Just like if you ever propose like a San Diego Vegas service, it doesn't have to go through LA. And frankly, with the available tracks, it shouldn't and doesn't need to. And having more services like the Palmetto to connect a bunch of cities that should have service and might be too far away from each other to justify a corridor service is something that needs to be considered beyond does it go to some massive city like New York. And it also could be a way of possibly justifying shorter, more frequent corridor service in the long run. And I've already rapid-fired the routes. And so this isn't to say that I want Amtrak to fail or anything. It's like I criticize it because I want them to do better. And the plan they are posting it's just a means to get the NEC's deferred maintenance paid for and just give us the rest of the country enough to be like, oh, this is a national plan, even though it's really not. And as I mentioned, if Amtrak was asking for the same amount of funding proportionally for the rest of the country, it would be $469 billion on top of the Northeast 55. And this alt route, again, also ignores a lot of routes that could be done in 15 years, because for what little they're asking for, 15 years is way too long for this to happen. Frankly, what they propose could probably be done in 5 if they actually got around to it. And I remember reading some of the discourse on Twitter over this, is that literally Wisconsin, who's been dragging its feet on adding service along the Empire Builders route, got a road built for the Foxconn factory in under a year. So if a state and the feds and Amtrak were actually gonna be forceful with this, what they proposed, excluding what I have proposed, could probably be done within 5 to 6 years. So them trying to give themselves 15 is just ridiculous. And I know another thing is that Amtrak is possibly going to get $5 billion in a dedicated grant program because that's what some people in the House want. I think this is also a very insufficient amount of funding. Amtrak needs $5 billion in annual operating funds directed towards it in the states, along with a mandate to run what would be considered state services. $5 billion annually that Amtrak could be competing against states with for funding is going to get eaten up very quickly. And again, Amtrak needs more than a stable pittance of funding and a Northeast bailout. All of these funding asks are just Amtrak asking for what is politically practical, quote unquote, instead of what is actually needed. And politically practical is basically just the free space in politics. It's it basically costs very little, will hurt very little if things go sideways, and it may or may not pay out any major dividends, but it'll at least make you look good. So it's Amtrak needs to be a lot more ambitious, and this is very much a failure of leadership. And I know people and I'm going to really give Joe Biden shit for this and people who defend him. He may be Amtrak Joe, but he's Northeast Joe as much as he is Amtrak Joe. And this funding proposal makes me realize that no, he's not a friend of Amtrak. He's a friend of the Northeast Corridor. And people really need to be hey, upfront about this and be hey, no, this may seem like it's good for Amtrak, but it's really not in the long run. So we should be demanding more out of it. And that's just going to be my 2 cents. So, do the YouTube thing down below. See ya.